Hey everyone, welcome to session 2 on Ernst Bloch and Psychoanalysis. I'm Daniel. I'm very happy to welcome you again for this study group. So tonight we're looking at a very important concept in Bloch's principle of hope called the not yet conscious, and an analysis which we read for pages roughly 45 through 114 and then 114 through 142 on anticipatory consciousness and on the discovery of the not yet conscious. So Itai Farhi is going to lead this discussion, but we're looking here at a kind of deep dive into Bloch's theory of the Freudian unconscious. He's offering a strong critique of the superego, the ego, the id. The whole sort of machinery of the Freudian conceptual apparatus is analyzed. And a lot of emphasis is placed on the category of the daydream and the phenomenon of the daydream, and its linkage to utopia and to hope. So Itai is a philosopher and a very good friend of mine. Very excited that he's agreed to lead this discussion. He has a presentation to offer, and he's said that the policy is for anybody can, jump in and intervene at any time in a polite and comradely way, obviously. But Itai, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. Can everyone hear me? Just thumbs up if you can. Awesome. So I'm going to try sharing my screen. Also, just so you know, I need to do a little check-in just because of my day job. So at a certain point at 5:20, if you hear an alarm go off, I might need to just take 30 seconds and do that, but it shouldn't take very long. Okay, so let's get started. This is a little map or diagram of what we had to read for today. Don't worry too much about this diagram. It's not meant to be like an exhaustive schematic of everything that's going on, but just to give you a sense, we're starting with the urge. The urge matures into a drive. Drives for Bloch can be drives that we want or drives that we don't want, right? So a drive can propel us forward even if we don't want it to, but then we can also want to have a drive, right? And then beyond that, like what we ultimately want can be wanting something that was happening in the past, but it can also be wanting something that will happen in the future. And this is where we go into expectation. And then expectation ultimately is going to develop into the not yet. And all of this is kind of circulating around what we talked about in the last session, which is the utopian function. So if there's any questions about this diagram, I'm happy to go over them, but we don't need to get too bogged down in the details. All right, here we go. So this is a little cautionary note just before we get too deep into this presentation. Just a few things to keep in mind. First of all, I am not a Bloch expert. Bloch is not an area of my expertise. I haven't studied him really. I've read a few essays by him, but I'm not like a super knowledgeable authority about Bloch. So just keep that in mind. Also, I don't assume any prior knowledge. So if a term or concept that I'm using is confusing, please don't hesitate to ask. There are no stupid questions. My reading is definitely not an innocent reading. I am approaching Bloch's text primarily as a philosopher. Other approaches to his work are also valid. So if you're coming at this from a kind of psychoanalytic perspective, or from the perspective of cultural theory, or a number of other perspectives, that's fine. And the fact that I'm approaching this kind of from a philosophical perspective, trying to reconstruct what the arguments are, that's only one approach. On that note, I'm trying to provide the groundwork. So the definitions and some of the background assumptions for discussing Bloch's text. There's more to be said about this, and this is by no means exhaustive. And finally, as a facilitator, I am going to be intervening in the discussion sparingly. I don't want to dominate the discussion. So unless a question is addressed to me specifically, I will probably not just be the first to answer it. Okay, moving right along. The text starts out with some what sometimes feels like a little bit of logic chopping, or like very definitionally specific work. And so he's making very fine differentiations between striving and longing, between need and drive. But I think this is not trivial. It's actually kind of important, and it's important for where he's trying to go with it. That we understand the differences between these, what might in our common usage just kind of all blur together. So for Bloch, we start with an urge, and then urging expresses itself. So the key word there is express. Expresses itself as a striving. Background for striving, if you know a bit of German idealism, think here about Fichte. Think about striving towards a goal that we can never really get to, right? Then when the striving is felt, it becomes longing. And he says, longing is the only honest state in all men. The longing itself is no less vague and general than the urge, but at least it is clearly directed outwards. So already here in 2 sentences, we've gone from urging to striving, and then from striving to longing. I'll also just say, kind of as a kind of footnote for this, Bloch, we mentioned in the last session, was very much in dialogue with George Lukács. And Lukács has a very interesting essay in his collection Soul and Form on longing and form. So if you're interested in this question of longing, we can definitely talk more about how Bloch is thinking about this, and how he probably to some extent has Lukács in mind. More on the idea of longing. Longing must first clearly drive towards something. So it's something definite. It's not just going in every direction at once. Crucially, and I think this is important, this concept, undoubtedly often dulled and reified in a reactionary way, should be understood as meaning the same as need. But since the word need does not also have the resonance of goal-directed driving, the word drive and the concept understood in an undull way may be allowed to stand. So from Bloch's perspective, and I think this is really important, until we get to the drive, we're still on kind of shifting ground. Once we have a drive, we have something we can work with. We have something definite, something definitive, something that has an aim. So let's keep going with some of these definitions. So Bloch wants to say that there's not just craving, right? Craving is what we were talking about on the previous slide, but there's also wishing. So a wish is more extensive than craving. It's not just a craving for cupcakes, say, but it's adding more color. That's the phrase that he uses. And he'll say that a wish eagerly looks forward to an imagined idea. In German, the term is Vorstellung. If you have some idea from Kant or from Hegel, Vorstellung, Hegel sometimes will call that picture thought. In Kant, we sometimes call that a representation, in which the desire causes what is its own to be pictured. Craving is certainly much older than the imagining of the something which is craved. And then we're going to go from distinguishing between wishing and an even stronger desire, which is going to be wanting. So he says the mere imagined idea, again, imagined idea, Vorstellung, thus becomes a wishful image, stamped with the cachet, this is how it should be. But here, wishing, no matter how strong it is distinguished from actual wanting. And then skipping ahead a little bit in this quote, talks about the example of weather, right? Wishes can even be entirely irrational. We can wish that X or Y were still alive. It is possibly meaningful to wish this, but meaningless to want it. Therefore, the wish remains even where the will can no longer change anything. So this is a very important difference, I think, between a wish, I can wish for someone who's dead to be resurrected, and a want. A want is something that I can actually work towards. Okay, a little bit more about wishing and wanting. There's an interesting moment at the very beginning of the reading we did for today, where Bloch talks about how it is as if, and notice the word, excuse me, key phrase as if, right? So again, if you're thinking in the context of German idealism, think about regulative ideals, right? Think about things that are not actually constitutive, but that structure what is possible, how we can imagine things. Whereas every drive certainly seems to appear as a who. So for every drive that I have, it really feels like there is a who that is driving it, as if the body did not contain the drive, but the drive contained the body, and determined it, dyed it respectively, black with rage, green with envy, red with anger, like a piece of cloth. And then in the same kind of as if vein, again, notice I've bolded the as if, an isolated drive direction, which appears almost self-sufficient, overwhelms not only the body, but also the conscious ego and confronts it as something alien. This is also true in healthy people at the moment when they are overpowered by a drive feeling, as if the emotion were a master in itself. Then we may say, it was not the lovesick girl who went into the water out of grief, but the grief which went into the water with the lovesick girl. So again, there's this feeling once we get into drives that is a kind of surplus, right? And this surplus fundamentally has to do with going beyond containment. And in a weird way, the surplus contains us, right? So here Bloch makes an interesting suggestion. And I think if you've seen the White Lotus, this is just the image that came to mind for me. I don't know if anyone has actually seen this show. Very funny show. But this is where Bloch will say that conscious man is the most difficult of all animals to satisfy. Why is that the case? Because in the gratification of our wishes, we are the animal which makes detours. And then on the same page, he gives an example of this. He talks about how even people who have everything, even the rich and sated, possibly suffer from the strange itch of the I don't know what it is. Luxury, above all, which does appear to fulfill everything, is an insatiable driver. So this is Tanya from the White Lotus. I don't know if anyone remembers her story. She's kind of this aging woman who doesn't really know what to do with her life anymore and goes to Hawaii to try to rediscover herself. I think she's a pretty good example of someone who has everything, someone who suffers from this strange itch. Okay, so moving right along, unless there are any questions, maybe I'll just pause here quickly. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to say? No? All right. So I wanted to go over a few of Bloch's objections to Freud, first of all. This is really the meat of what we were reading for today. So first of all, I wanted to talk about how Bloch understands the role of the reality principle and how it relates to the ego. So Bloch has a kind of searing critique of Freud's construction here. From Bloch's perspective, the ego is trying to remove unpleasant feelings through the fulfillment of drives, but it sees to this fulfillment in its own way, in a censoring, moralizing way, and above all, with respect to what can be achieved, to quote unquote reality. So this reality, of course, is going to be a bourgeois reality. This moralizing element, i.e. what has adapted to the practices of Freud's bourgeois environment, is, according to Freud, the acquired line of the ego drive. Thus, there even occurs a penetration of the libido, hence of the pleasure principle, which otherwise determines all drive processes. The adult, or better, the bourgeois individual. I want to actually linger on that for a moment. Bloch is being very careful here with his wording. The adult, or better. What does that or better mean? It doesn't mean that, there aren't adults. It means that what we understand as adults from Bloch's perspective is just bourgeois individuality, right? The bourgeois individual seen by Freud in a bourgeois way wears down his Dionysian horns on reality, as Freud calls his bourgeois environment, the commodity world and its ideology. So to summarize up that kind of long and slightly difficult quote, the way I'm putting this is that his first objection to psychoanalysis is that psychoanalysis personalizes the discontent with civilization, when really the discontent with civilization isn't so much a personal discontent as you could say a sub or a transpersonal discontent. And then on this slide, two more objections. Here again, this is pretty straightforward. Bloch is going to accuse psychoanalysis of being stuck in the past. So he'll say that the unconscious of psychoanalysis is therefore never a not yet conscious, an element of progressions. It consists rather of regressions. So that's the second objection. Is psychoanalysis able to articulate progression, or is it just constantly stuck in the past? And then for the third objection, and I think this one might be the most damning, Bloch will say that fundamentally psychoanalysis cannot understand drive because it can't understand the basic drives of self-preservation. So it can't understand hunger, and it can't understand the simple drive to keep oneself alive. So this is a pretty fundamental objection, right? That if everything is ultimately reducible to libidinal conflicts and so on, like how do we account for just basic hunger and self-preservation, people who are poor and want to make their lives better? Is that poverty somehow reducible to the libido? But he's not just going to be criticizing Freud. He also has a pretty powerful critique of Jung. This is a picture that, again, I was reminded of in doing the reading. This is Dani from Midsommar. She's just discovered that her partner has cheated on her. Oh, and that's my alarm. One moment. Sorry for this. I apologize. One moment. Cool. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, actually, doesn't matter. Okay. So can everyone still hear me? Just check in. Apologies for the alarm. Thumbs up. Yes? Yep. All good? Okay. So now we're looking at Jung, right? And the reason I bring up Midsommar here is because I think this is a great example of the kind of, he'll talk about this in terms of psychosynthesis and folk community. And I think Midsommar is a really nice example of how the folk community, in this case, is consoling Dani after, she feels betrayed by her boyfriend and so on. Okay, so let's dig into what does he actually say about this. And again, it's worth mentioning that he's not just talking about Jung here, he's talking about a broader trend in culture. So this applies to a lot of kind of German culture in Weimar, kind of reactionary German culture, where the path to the so-called heights lost some of its interest and prospects, in exact proportion to the decline of free enterprise. The path became more attractive, which led into the so-called depths, in which the eyes roll instead of aiming at a goal. I think that's a very striking image. So from Bloch's perspective, in this world, from this kind of reactionary perspective, everything new is ipso facto without value, in fact, hostile to value. The only thing that is new today is the destruction of instinct, the undermining of the ancient basic ground of the imagination by the intellect. So from this kind of Jungian and more broadly atavistic and proto-fascistic perspective, according to Bloch, there's a struggle between imagination and intellect. Intellect is the bad one, right? Intellect is the kind of one that destroys everything, doesn't value the life world and so on. And imagination is the good one. Imagination is kind of the sustaining force of the organic community. So Maybe actually I'll pause on that again to see if anyone has anything they want to say here on the critique of Freud and Jung.
I found it interesting that he accuses kind of the early move of Adler to be Nietzschean. So like he presents a kind of strong critique against Adler precisely because he thinks that this early move of ego psychology, which discards the Freudian thesis of neurosis as being caused by kind of sexual repression or being caused by the complexes and so on, but rather is driven by issues of self-confidence, right? He actually argues that this is even more dangerous than the Freudian school and then the Freudian theory. And the Freudian theory is more worth retaining a kind of engagement with than this Nietzschean thing, because in that one, it's full capitulation to capitalist reality principle, right? Whereas psychoanalysis has these kind of other avenues by which it's trying to resolve the contradictions of bourgeois life. Even though the Freudian approach and the Jungian approach are inadequate, there's something within Freud that needs to be thought through. So it's kind of very anti-Nietzschean point. That's one thing. I think it's also obviously interesting that in the opening diagram that you showed us, the whole thesis of anticipatory consciousness, we should talk about, and I'm sure you plan to, we should talk about its neglect by Freud, and why is it neglected by Freud would be an interesting question, I think. I don't know if you've thought about that, because from that, then obviously the not yet conscious becomes this new conceptual category from which you can then sort of reclaim a better psychoanalytic theory in general. So those are some impressions there. I also think it's really interesting what he has to say about sublimation in some of this. Because, yeah, I'll stop, but some impressions.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, if I would just like to basically highlight some things from your presentation so far. Yeah, basically his critique of Freud is that it is not generative of anything. It has to capitulate to this censorship, which is itself conditioned by bourgeois values and this and that. And perhaps we could also say that, according to Bloch, Freud's understanding of the drives is not the drives of, as determined by human nature itself, but rather the drives here are appreciated as the drives of a bourgeois person or a petty bourgeois person. And all this is fine and well. And, perhaps we could be, we could historicize Freud in saying that his project is still of value because, I think it's interesting, what are the drives as appreciated by petty bourgeois people, right? But at the same time, Bloch intensifies his criticism in saying that, I guess what I mean to say is that we could be generous to Freud in saying that his project was not aware of its class implications. But as Bloch points out, there is a sign on one of the clinics that says, you can't talk about that you're starving to death because you can't afford food. So in that way, Bloch is pointing out that Freud's clinic had explicit class interests in catering to specific people. And anyway, in saying this, I know Daniel Tubanamba is a friend of this channel. His Desire of Psychoanalysis, which is an amazing book. I hope everybody gets it. There's a long chapter about how paying for psychoanalysis is fundamental to the clinic and so on. But nonetheless, we need to make this clinic accessible to people who cannot afford analysis, right? But anyway, Tubanamba's basic claim is that psychoanalysis and its material that it generates will be as large as insofar as it wants to address class problems. And also, I know I'm talking a little bit long, but just a quick digression. We should not forget that Fanon, who is often cited as if you're interested in neocolonial literature and criticism and so on, like that's the person you have to read. And it's funny when people talk about him, like it's often left out in the conversation that he was an analyst, right? So I just mean to say that the more interesting analysis that we can generate will be interesting insofar as we are reaching out to people who are not like Freud's patients, right? So yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Connor.
Now, I do want to point out one book by Elizabeth Dano called Freud's Free Clinics. And he did start a movement to have free clinics all over Europe and was big on this. It just didn't go through, including like polyclinics and stuff that I think is sort of inspired what's called the GIFRIC, the Quebec School of Psychoanalysis, and other things like that. I won't say more about that, but Freud was not blind to class. So.
Yeah, that's a great text. The Freud's Free Clinics. Although it should be noted, by the time that Principle of Hope is being written, it's fair to say that psychoanalysis as an institution had become much more bourgeoisified. So it's also interesting that Wilhelm Reich is not an interlocutor here. That's an interesting choice. I don't know why Reich is not invoked. You would think that there would be quite a lot of, I don't know, kind of comradely, and I mean, I see quite a lot of it as well. I do wonder about how Bloch treats sexuality as such. I mean, in his conversation on D.H. Lawrence, and in his conversation on the way that the sex drive is theorized by Freudians and the Freudian school in general, I wouldn't say that Bloch is giving us a kind of Puritan aesthetic, but at the same time, he seems to strongly suggest in my reading that kind of any sexual libertinism can't quite get out of a kind of, I don't know, bourgeois trap, let's say. I don't know if others have thoughts on that, but or Itai, since you have probably done the closest reading on this section, what your thoughts are on Bloch's view on sexual liberation. I don't know if you've thought about that.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a few things you can say about this. Before I go too much into the details, I do want to say one thing about the accessibility of psychoanalysis, and this will also come up later. I have like a quote from the reading about where Bloch actually makes very similar argument to what you were saying, Connor, about like, who is the clientele, who is this for, right? And Bloch will explicitly say, like, this is for parasites. That's the word he uses, right? And I found that a little bit uncomfortable. Like, I was like, ooh, I'm not sure about that, buddy. Like, maybe rethink that. But like, Bloch is definitely on your side here, right? Like, I think Bloch is very uncomfortable with the way that psychoanalysis is kind of geared towards a particular clientele and towards their perspective, right?
If I could just follow up and saying, and trying to, I totally agree with everything you're saying. I just want to summarize my points very quickly. At bottom, I feel like Bloch's point in critiquing Freud is that if the ego is not generative, if the is not generative and capitulates to bourgeois sentiments, then it has no tools to combat against capitalism. Like, that's the problem. And more than that, which is to ultimately say that it's in service of maintaining capital. And then he goes further in critiquing Jung, that in saying that Jung's project is ultimately anticipating or in service of, or very ripe to be exploited by fascists. So yeah, very scathing critique.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think from Bloch's perspective, definitely psychoanalysis, like he'll say this a lot throughout the reading, and he'll say this in general if you read his work. Psychoanalysis is valid, right? Insofar as it kind of expresses a correlation that is real, like it's really there. It's really the case that the unconscious behaves a lot of the time in this way, but it kind of writes off a certain kind of futural orientation, right? And I think this is where also, Daniel, to your point about, libertinism, right? We could make, I mean, Bloch himself doesn't say this, right? But we could make kind of a connection to the way that later authors Lacan and Deleuze will think about sadism and masochism, right? So with, this is a tangent obviously, but it might be relevant later on, like the idea that, what is Lacan's critique of Sade, right? I'm drawing especially on Aaron Schuster's book, The Trouble with Pleasure, right? But Lacan has a very powerful and very devastating critique of Sade. He'll say, okay, Sade, like wonderful, you want to destroy the world, you want to return to prime nature, like awesome, right? But what's the issue with that? That destruction has already happened, right? You're trying to go backwards and have a new beginning, but that destruction's already happened. We're living in a world that has already been destroyed, right? Similarly, you can say the same kind of point about Mazak, right? Mazak wants to kind of retreat back into a kind of glacial past, right? And this is the point that, again, if you read Coldness and Cruelty, the Deleuze book on Mazak, he's very clear, like the desire that Mazak has is this desire for a kind of glacial mother. And that this glacial mother fundamentally is an archaic mother. And so in both of these cases, at least if you think that Lacan and Deleuze's analysis are at least a little bit on point, and I think they are, at least getting at something, then yeah, there is something about perversion, you could say from a Lacanian perspective, that is looking backwards. And it would be interesting to think about what would be a form of perversion which looks forwards, like trying to invent new forms of kinship, trying to invent new forms of desire, and so on. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Yeah, no, it totally does. I mean, I think Bloch's analysis of Freud and Jung is useful because he basically says on one hand, we have a kind of authoritarian liberal, and then on the other, we have the great fascistic psychoanalyst. And so there's this sort of tendency for, and even his discussion, I think I really like this idea. I'm gonna footnote this or write about this at some point, but you remember that point where he talks about how psychoanalysis actually inculcates the superstructures into the unconscious? I thought that was a very interesting point, especially given Bloch's later analysis of cultural phenomenon. And so the way that psychoanalysis is complicit in the furthering of certain superstructural ideologies is an interesting point. But, you know, for a thinker like Bloch, just I think as for Reich, the sadistic drive cannot be untethered from capitalist exploitation processes, which itself is something which would totally be rejected from a metaphysical standpoint by someone like Freud. So here we have someone whose maxim is not Reich's, like desire is productive. But it would be interesting if we were to ask ourselves, like, okay, we were going to take Bloch's critique of psychoanalysis and kind of distill it down into a sort of principle, as Deleuze and Guattari do with Wilhelm Reich, which is desire is productive. What would that principle be? And probably it would be connected to this notion of the not yet conscious. But I'm still trying to sort of decipher what's most useful in Bloch's analysis of psychoanalysis. There seems like a lot of stuff here that is very useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. The other thing I'll say, has just occurred to me, is that, again, just treating Sade and Mazak as kind of classical figures of libertinism, right? There are actually utopian elements in both of these thinkers, and they're quite like interesting utopian elements, right? So there, you could kind of imagine doing some kind of Blochian project of trying to think about the traces of utopia in Sade, right? Like reading again, you know, the bit from Philosophy in the Bedroom and trying to think about like, okay, like what is this weird utopia that Sade is trying to construct? Like, why is Sade so convinced that like the right to jouissance or whatever is such a meaningful thing. And again, like this would become quite relevant in terms of contemporary discussions on the right to sex, right? That Saad actually is one of the earliest thinkers to make the claim that yes, people do have a right to sex, right? So it would be interesting to think about it in that context. Similarly with Mazak, yes, on the one hand, he's internalizing certain elements of a superstructure, right? He's internalizing the idea of contracts, and contracts obviously have to do with property and so on. But you could also talk about how like he's fundamentally changing the nature of a relationship by thinking about it in this way, right? So by making explicit all of the kind of things that bourgeois society would prefer not to talk about, there actually is something utopian there, right? So again, that's a tangent, but it might be worth further developing.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
First of all, I totally agree, and I would like to like kind of revisit how Bloch appreciates the unconscious and how it is that it internalizes the superstructure. Like that's something that I like noticed in passing and wanted to return to. So maybe we can talk about it some more here. But anyway, I kind of wanted to just talk about and maybe even provide a little bit of a critique of Bloch, like because I understand his political project and trying to be very radical in his critique of Freud and this and that, but he at some point he seems to be settled on this point where he is rejecting history, and he begins to appreciate history and the past as only appreciable within one's lived experience. And he basically says that like all we need in order to cultivate revolutionary angst or potential, whatever you want to call it, you have those resources and experiences and so on within your lived experience, your immediate lived experience.
Connor,
so,
can I just quickly, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but this is actually going to be one of my discussion questions for later.
Okay, so
hold on to that. No, not at all. I have the same question you do. So hold on to that, and we'll get to that for sure. Anything else before we finish off?
I have a question.
Shoot.
So I don't know at all anything about Bloch. So, but from what I'm hearing, I will want to know if there is a relationship, or because, well, I know Bloch had conversations with Adorno, so I will want to know what will be his critique, or he accepts the fact that Adorno criticizes the reality principle as being the reification of capitalism, right? What will Bloch think about that?
Does anyone else want to field this? I mean, I have some stuff I can say about this, but probably someone else would be better to answer this.
You should do it.
Oh, go ahead, Daniel, if you have something you want to say.
No, please.
Okay. So Adorno is going to criticize Bloch, right, for kind of drifting too far away from political economy, right, and from the categories of political economy. And like, yes, you do get in Bloch a kind of very powerful critique of the commodity world, but you don't really get the kind of nitty gritty attention to detail that you'll find in someone like Adorno. And in part, this has to do with a different focus, right? So Adorno is more interested in, in sociological questions, basically, than Bloch is, and is more interested in applying, broadly speaking, Lukács's categories in a cultural way. So applying Lukács's understanding of reification to the analysis of culture, right? For Bloch, that's not really what he's trying to do. So he's sort of allied with it, but he's less interested in those kinds of political economic questions, I would say. I'm not sure if other people would agree with that.
So can we say that he's not interested in rejecting the reality principle as Adorno is?
Well, he's rejecting it for different reasons. That might be the way I would approach it, right? Adorno is rejecting the reality principle as the kind of representative of reification, right, as you say. For Bloch, what's wrong with the reality principle is not so much that it reifies us, although yes, of course, that's a problem. For Bloch, the problem with the reality principle, here, I'll go take us back a slide. The problem with the reality principle is that it wears down our Dionysian horns. So Bloch wants to kind of, and this again goes to the question of sexual liberation. I think Bloch actually is very connected to this kind of Dionysian impulse within culture. And this, I mean, if we want to criticize him for this, we can. Like, there's a kind of left Nietzscheanism in what Bloch is doing here, I would suggest. But I do think that to some extent, his critique of the reality principle is closer in some ways to Marcuse than it would be to Adorno, right? It's saying like, the problem with the reality principle is that it restricts, represses, rather than that it expresses some kind of economic imperative, right?
Maybe would you say not because Bloch is against reality, but he wants a different reality. So it's like he rejects the reality principle, he de-emphasizes it because the current reality is insufficient. So for the sake of a future better reality, his praxis is sort of not ignoring of the reality principle, but sort of trying to sidestep it with this sort of imaginative Marxism.
Yeah, I think you could say that. I think that sounds about right to me.
I think the other thing I would say here is that, like, where a lot of the Frankfurt School theoreticians follow Freud is precisely in the way that the repressive apparatus has a certain efficacious hold on subjectivity. I think that Bloch's categories that he's working with here actually reject a lot of that certain repressive hypotheses, not as necessarily totally fictional, but maybe not as efficacious as the Freudo-Marxist would, if that makes sense. So therefore, I don't think that he's going to follow them in that specific direction, where like someone like Marcuse in Eros and Civilization is very much, I think, interested in furthering a theory of the subject that is based on sexual repression, and I don't know that Bloch is.
Yeah, I mean, not to say too much about this, but I think that the reason I'm putting him closer to Marcuse than to Adorno is because I think both of them are committed to reclaiming Dionysus, right? So both of them are to some extent saying, like, we need to have the Dionysian element, or else it's not really revolutionary, right? And I think Adorno is not as interested, frankly, in Dionysus. Like, Adorno's revolution is not so much the revolution of joyfulness, dancing, parties, excess, and so on. Whereas I think both Marcuse and Bloch, in their own ways, granted Marcuse is much more Freudian than Bloch, are trying to very consciously reclaim the Dionysian.
There's a nice essay to be written about Bloxnetianism, which also appears later in Heritage of Our Times. I would love to, that would be a fun project to work on, actually.
Cool. Actually, my computer is running low on battery. So if people want to talk about something for just a minute, I will get my charger. I should have gotten it earlier. I'm sorry about this, guys, and I'll be right back. Okay, well, guess not. That was very loud. Anyway, so we were now talking about anxiety and despair, unless there is anything else that people would like to talk about before we move on.
Just at the end on 63, do y'all think that, quote, in Freud, the unconscious is combated? Whereas in Jung, it's accepted. I really don't know Jung, so I'm just asking on Freud.
Well, page 53?
63 at the very bottom.
53?
Do you want to read out the context for that, like the sentence before, maybe?
Sure. let's see, where's a good place to start? The basic drive becomes a drive towards the basic ground where Dionysus only wants to be called Moloch. A basic ground of aggressio is praised as medicine and morality, a ground from which everything human has again become estranged. Thus Freud, as we said, who did at least want to bring liberal enlightenment, and the fascistic mystifier Jung, present extensive contradictions in their common depth psychology, as it modestly calls itself. The liberal wants to make repressed material conscious. The reactionary wants to connect conscious material back with the repressed, to push it back even deeper into the unconscious. In Freud, the unconscious is combated, and as far as it is individually acquired, kept in the orbit of the individual. In Jung, the unconscious is welcomed and completely settled in the archaic collective. Stop there.
So your question is this an unfair diagnosis of Jungian psychology and Jungian archetypal theory and so on? Is that kind of what you're wondering?
No, actually, I'm real noob with Jung, real noob, but with it was the part that I said in Freud, or in like, I guess we should take Freud as like standing in for probably institution of Freudian psychoanalysis at the time. But if in Freud's theory, the action of analysis is to combat the unconscious, whereas in Lacan we can probably, and I'm just doing this, if people don't know Lacan or care, it's fine. Just with Lacan, it's certainly not combating. You're not fighting language, even if you. But I don't even think language equals the unconscious. But it's not combat. It's like the struggle or practice is like to create and construct a convivial unconscious or something. Not
I think Freud is making this, he uses the word combat for a reason, right? He's saying what emerges from the unconscious is basically has the character of something like class interest potentially. And to beat it back down is it's in service of maintaining capital, which is to say that we'll just read it again. In Freud, the unconscious is combated, and as far as it is individually acquired, kept in the orbit of the individual. So it is in keeping the individual as an individual that we are, first of all, disarming solidarity, but in disarming the emergence of this psychical material, we are also disarming, again, revolutionary potential. So this is class war. This is basically what he's saying.
Yeah.
Well said.
It's also very similar to his critique of Hegelianism as well, because the argument is that in both models, they present predetermined aim fulfillments of the drives that have a certain loop to them, but they cannot think a kind of liberation of the drive, nor can they think the drive, as he says later, and as Itai also mentioned, as self-preservation and as hunger, which is interesting. But both have a kind of certain distinct strategy, which in the one case is liberal, in the other case is fascistic. But in both instances, they cannot think the new, they cannot think a break. So there's nothing, it's like offering a critique that neither Freud or Jung have a theory of novelty. So what I see there is an interesting thing similar to his critique of Hegelian anamnesis as well. I don't know. I mean, it's. I don't know how I feel about it, but it's something. It's definitely something.
One note on this: there's a lot to be said about Bloch and Hegel and whether Bloch's critique of Hegel is fair. But just on the question of novelty, I think one thing you can say is that the way that Bloch is thinking about novelty is not what we would today, in a kind of like post-Badouian way, talk about as the event. Bloch is actually very clear that his concept of novelty is not the event, right? So when he's talking about the novum or anything like that, he very explicitly says this is not an event, right? And I think that we should hold on to that, because when we talk about the new today, like Badiou makes a very similar critique, right? Badiou makes a very similar point For example, when he's talking about Ecclesiastes, right, he'll say that like a lot of people really basically live in a world that is the world of Ecclesiastes, the world where there is nothing new under the sun. And he'll say, what is new under the sun is the event, right? And Bloch would agree that there is something new under the sun, but he'll say, no, it's not the event, it's the not yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, let's just, to be clear that the new is not one thing, it's many things. Should I go on, or are there more questions? Or comments, interventions? You're feeling grumpy and you want to express yourself.
It is interesting that someone spoke. Okay, it is interesting that the not yet almost takes the role of the reality principle, right? As not yet I'm fulfilled, not yet I have the pleasure of the phallus, right? Don't you think it's the same mechanism?
Well, Lacan does say somewhere that the phallus never ceases to be written, right? So there's always more to say, there's always more to write, there's always more to think about in the phallus. So maybe the phallus is a kind of bad not yet.
Yep.
Josh, it sounded like you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to, because I'm quite interested in Bloch's conception of the new, because and maybe we should defer this conversation to the next session where we'll look more closely at Bloch's critique of Bergson. But it seems to me that Bloch, he kind of has a way of like qualifying what really counts as new in the way that a realist wants to qualify what really counts as real. And for Bloch, the ultimate measure of what is new is the overcoming of the subject object, or what we might also describe as full conditioning, or like complete entelechy, as he describes it. And I understand Bloch is saying that the issue with I think the issue with like this kind of concept of the new that we've inherited, at least we've inherited from post-structuralism with I guess the Bergsonism of Deleuze and so on, is that if you define the new as the negation, or so I know that negativity is a problematic association with Deleuze, but if you define newness as what is not complete or something, right, or what is just becoming, then I think Bloch wants to say, yeah, that's just the same thing that's always happening, or something, right? Does that make sense?
That does make sense to me. Yeah, that's helpful.
And I think it's a really interesting. I just think it's a really interesting way of qualifying what counts as new. And I think in a way I certainly find it a significant challenge to to sort of like the concept of the new and the events that I guess we are quite used to in continental philosophy. And whenever I read, so because I quite like reading Deleuze and Deleuze and Guattari, but whenever, and it's not just Deleuze and Guattari, I mean, there's so many sort of post-structuralist or continental things that I read, but we find in these thinkers these sort of affirmation of possibility, right? Like of that for me, continental philosophy is really about the is really largely about philosophizing new possibilities or something. And I know that's a very boring and generalization, but at the same time, this affirmation of like alternative possibility never really seems to be like there's something ascetic about it, because it's never really like, as soon as that possibility is taken up to be the possibility of a complete utopian future, then it's instantly problematized in quite an ascetic way. So yeah, I just find it interesting that for Bloch, that's not the negation of newness. That is what is ultimately new. That is how to qualify what is going to be radically new.
Well, I think here it might be helpful to return to the text and what I felt was a kind of crucial moment. This is on page 76. He talks about this Marx quote, where before the worker actually creates what it is that they're going to do, you know, pick up the hammer and so on, the thing is already made in their mind. He says, following that quote, therefore it follows, before a builder in all areas of life knows his plans, he must have planned the plan himself, and must have anticipated its realization as a brilliant, even decisively spurring forward dream. So I think this is kind of what Itai was talking about, in this distinction between, like, if we were going to put it in relation to Badiou and his understanding of event, this is basically saying, like, the event has happened before it has happened, insofar as the event is occurring within our minds before it is ultimately then realized, right? So it's the new as generated and appreciated within the worker's mind. You know, utopia exists in our mind before it is ultimately realized. And this formulation is itself, of course, always pointing forward towards the new. It's not, it's perhaps determined by our experiences and the past, but it's distinctively new. So I think this is a big part where his formulation of new is determined in this excerpt here on page 76.
Yeah, I mean, it's not working with a kind of structural causality model, which is anti-humanist and which is opposed to the category of consciousness, as we have with Althusser, which is the basis of Badiou's theorization of the event. This is very much working within a kind of humanism and within a theory of consciousness on the one hand. And on the other hand, he says, and I think part of the reason why he can critique Freud and Jung as kind of having this fidelity or allegiance to the unconscious, not being able to transcend it, is because on page 116, he actually says that Freud at one point argues that if we posit the possibility of a non-repressed unconscious, then we lose the character of the unconsciousness as such, which I think is actually an extremely important point here, because it's at that point where Bloch pinpoints a type of negative reliance on the unconscious itself and a kind of capitulation on Freud's part that, like, okay, this is something which can be, I don't know, worked around or transcended or something like this. So I'm jumping ahead slightly in terms of the pages, but I think that's worth noting.
So if I got it right, for Bloch, the goal is to annihilate the unconscious, or to erase the fact that there is something unconscious.
Bloch is wholly.
Go ahead, Josh.
So I know I was just going to say Bloch is, and I think it's really important to note this. You know, what Bloch is affirmative about in Freud is that Freud wants to make the unconscious conscious to a certain extent. I mean, I know, you know, Freud is obviously not as maximal about this as Bloch is, but I think, yeah, it's important to know that yeah, Bloch ultimately wants to make the unconscious conscious, and you know, not just the forgotten, not just the repressed, but also what has not yet emerged in reality. Like, Bloch is really, like, you know, fully utopian, very maximal about this. When he's talking about overcoming the subject and object, he really, I think, and how I understand it, he really does mean to yeah, just have a, you know, to complete the system of German idealism, you know, just to have this yeah, this kind of absolute knowledge in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that it sounds kind of what Itai was talking about, sad, you know, the utopia of sad, of full destruction, of going back to nature, in this case of going back to a state that is pure consciousness. I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We should address that when we talk about the daydream. I think that's where that could be discussed. I'm sure Itai has slides on the daydream, I'm assuming, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a little bit of stuff on this. It was Luis that asked the question about the abolishing the unconscious, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually think on this slide, you might see a little bit of what you have in mind here on the bottom, where Bloch will say, and I think this is a very strong statement, that hope drowns anxiety, right? So if what we are used to thinking of as the unconscious is this kind of anxious unconscious, the sort of Freudian unconscious that is ultimately determined by anxiety, by dread, by all these kinds of feelings, fear and so on, then yeah, in that sense, Bloch does want to drown that out. But I don't think that's all he's doing. And so I think he is also saying that there is a more positive unconscious, right? So he's sort of saying that there's a negative unconscious, that's the one that psychoanalysis is mostly focused on, but there's also the unconscious of hope, all of these traces of belief in a better future that has never been actualized. And that's what he's going to try to really bring to the fore. Sorry, go ahead.
I just highly recommend page 116 to look at where it's probably his most convincing case against Freud there, in my opinion, because he quotes Freud as recognizing that there is a third non-repressed unconscious, but then goes on to show why Freud denies further elaborating it. Then that becomes the springboard for his own elaboration of the not yet conscious. So anyways.
Cool. Just very quickly, because we're towards the end of the presentation, I just want to get out the rest of this. So if you do have questions, please feel free to fire away, but I want to get to the end. So here, I won't read this whole quote. This is just a long quote where Bloch talks about despair as kind of the end of the road when it comes to what he calls negative expectant emotions. You can contrast this, I think, in a very fruitful way with Hegel, right? Hegel in the Phenomenology of Spirit will explicitly say that despair is actually very productive, right? So classically speaking, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, it's the pathway of despair or the highway of despair, right? So it's pretty much the exact opposite of that, right? Even though he's very influenced by Hegel and so on, this is not the kind of Lutheranism that you find in Hegel. And then the rest of this, I have a bunch of questions, and then for each question, I have a few quotes that go with it. So I'll just go through the questions, and then if any of these questions are interesting, then I'll go to the slide that has the quotes that are relevant to them. But first, I'll just go through the questions, and then we can go from there. So first of all, are we responsible for our dreams, right? Bloch will say at one point, isn't it ridiculous to think that we would be responsible for our dreams? And I thought to myself, is that ridiculous? I'm not sure that's ridiculous. So anyway, so I have the quote where Bloch talks about the being responsible for the dreams, and I wanted to contrast that with, for example, someone like Slavoj Žižek. Žižek will very famously say, yes, we are responsible for our dreams. We have to, we have to be able to accept that responsibility. So I'm not saying that one of them is right, the other is wrong, but I think we should not take it for granted. Beyond that, second question about boredom. And I didn't go too much into the details of Bloch's reading of Heidegger, but Bloch will basically say that Heidegger's analysis of boredom as a kind of fundamental mood is just kind of an effect of the mechanized capitalist enterprise. And I wasn't sure that that was quite right. I think he might be overstating the case there a little bit. Does boredom essentially belong to the mechanized capitalist enterprise? Would there not be any boredom at all in a communist society? I'm not so sure. Third question. This one's a little bit more difficult. We've talked in the last session about how for Lacan, anxiety is the only honest affect. And in this reading, Bloch will make the claim that longing is the only honest state in all men. So my question is, are anxiety and longing honest in the same way? And then kind of as a follow-up to this, if anyone knows Lacan's essay on logical time and the assertion of anticipated certainty, like what can we say about Bloch's concept of anticipation in contrast to Lacan's concept of anticipation? But if we don't know that essay, we don't have to go into it. It's not too important. Okay, fourth question. Bloch makes a point very strongly that castration is not the most plausible explanation for many of our anxieties, right? That there are all kinds of anxieties that are more plausibly explained as coming from kind of class worries and so on. And of course, you know, it's the case that psychoanalysis often uses castration as a just so story, right? So I'm sure we've all been familiar with people who overuse castration anxiety. Everything becomes castration anxiety, right? Deleuze and Guattari will make a very similar point. But Bloch seems to go too far in the other direction, it seems to me. Seems to kind of ignore castration at all. So do we think that's right? Number 5, and here I have the quote, I didn't read it, I probably should have. I'm just trying to get to these questions. Bloch will say, here, I'll just show it now. This is just a series of the daydream for him, the drug of choice is hashish, the utopia is the artificial paradise, the illness that corresponds to it is paranoia, and the god that corresponds to it is phantasos, the night dream, on the other hand, opium, oblivion, schizophrenia, and Morpheus. And Bloch will very strongly suggest that the daydream is better than the night dream, that the night dream just kind of sinks us back down into the past, the daydream gives us a future. And my question was, is it quite that simple? Can we save Morpheus? Is there a way for us to reclaim the night dream from the kind of fascistic, archaic world? Beyond that, this might be for the next session. So if we don't want to think about this right now, that's totally fine. But it came up for me about how does the warm stream that Bloch is here elaborating relate to the colder stream of Marxism, the more scientific stream of Marxism, and ultimately which is primary in the last instance. So which of these streams do we think like has the final word, we could say. Finally, this is very similar to what Connor was saying before about lived experience. You know, the philosophical perspective for this would be correlationism, right? The idea that we can only know what is correlated to our lived experience, right? And they're actually, Ray Brassier makes the case in Nihil Unbound that Bloch is a correlationist, right? So first of all, do we think that Bloch is a correlationist? Is Bloch kind of like stuck within this framework of the correlation between our lived experience and the structure of reality? And if so, how does that change how we think about him? And then finally, this is maybe a question we shouldn't even touch today, but it was something that came up in my mind a lot. Whenever Bloch talks about aesthetics, whenever he talks about Egypt, it's always negative. He always has something nasty to say about Egyptian aesthetics. And I was just thinking, well, okay, like probably part of why he's doing that is because there is a kind of exile narrative, like Exodus narrative, like out of Egypt means out of the bad, you know, previous way of being, and now we're moving forward into freedom, moving forward into whatever. But it seems to me that that's not totally consistent with his project, that there actually probably are utopian elements in Egyptian aesthetics. So I just wanted to think about like, in particular from a psychoanalytic perspective, if we think about there being continuity between Egypt and then like the Exodus narrative, what does that do to this kind of depreciation of Egypt that you find in Bloch? Anyway, that's a lot of stuff. If any of these questions are relevant, I can move to the quotes that that are kind of correlated to them.
So on the first one, there's a very famous book, well, not very famous, but actually not that well known, by Hans Sachs, who's a close confidant of Freud, called The Creative Unconscious. And it's a book about a theory of daydreams. And he posits two forms of daydream. One he calls the antisocial daydream of self-pity. And the other one he calls the kind of social poetic form of daydream, which is, but in both instances, this is what's I think interesting apropos Bloch, the daydream, even in its antisocial dimension, which means, I'm sorry, the second one is the first one's antisocial, the second one is called the mutual daydream. The mutual daydream. And in the mutual daydream, just as in the antisocial, in both instances, you're dealing with forbidden pleasures, right? So the daydream is an enactment of a type of confrontation with forbidden pleasures for which there is some kind of catharsis, usually. And so the repressive hypothesis is absolutely paramount in his thesis of the daydream. And it's very interesting to me because I feel that even though Bloch is opposed to a lot of this Freudian theory of repression and so on, I still think that actually Hans Sachs' theory of the daydream should be put in a conversation here and still has something positive to add, precisely because he sees in the daydream this kind of cathartic potential in a certain sense. And he talks about how like most youth, in fact, young people, when they daydream, they're actually working through mourning the loss of the maternal, and that this is the kind of scene of the daydream, right? And you don't see that kind of focus on the daydream in youth for Bloch. Like as far as Bloch is concerned, and what I gather is that youth is kind of unrepressed territory in some way. And I just really don't think that that's accurate.
Just sorry, a quick correction there, Daniel. Bloch will actually explicitly say that in contrast to castration, he thinks that the better explanation for why we have the anxieties we have are precisely because of this first separation from the mother, and that all of our later anxieties are reworkings of this first separation, right? So I actually do think Bloch has resources to accommodate the perspective you're describing.
Good. Oh, that's good. Yeah, I was a little concerned about this because I did get the sense that he's at times reads very opposed to thinking subjectivity along the lines of repression. So that's helpful to know that he does. So that was one thought that I had. I was also wondering if you could explain how you see Zizek making this claim of responsibility for dreams.
Oh, sure. This is a claim he explicitly makes. I know he makes it in his books, but maybe more famously, he makes it in one of his movies. They're a bit silly, but nevertheless, they're kind of fun, right? This is in Pervert's Guide to Ideology. It's the very last movie that he analyzes. So he's just finished analyzing the movie where the guy has surgery to completely change himself and completely change his life. And then the question is, why did it all fail? Why did this operation fail? And Zizek says it failed because they didn't change the guy's dreams, right? So the guy had the wrong dreams. And then he'll say, and this becomes his meditation on Zabriskie Point, he'll say, the crucial lesson of psychoanalysis when it comes, and again, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with him, but this is Zizek's perspective, that the crucial lesson of psychoanalysis, specifically, I think Lacanian psychoanalysis, when it comes, and he'll say, and of film criticism, is that we are responsible for our dreams. that the only way that we can actually change society is by changing the kinds of dreams that we have. So by working through the dreams we do have and saying like, hey, you know what, that's a bad dream. Like, I'm going to try to think and have a better dream by working through the materials in it that I can recognize are not doing me favors.
Okay.
To be more precise, I think he claims that we have to be responsible for our unconscious, right? And that comes dreams, all that, right?
I mean, he literally says we're responsible for our dreams. He will explicitly say that, but sure, yeah, I think both are true.
I'm with you, Itai. And responsible, like responding, like we should have a correspondence with our dreams, or at least answer to them, address them, and not simply sort of just wake up very quickly and get on with the day. See, in a way, it's sort of a psychoanalytic ethic, like just to like rush. Well, sometimes the alarms and bells of the day do drown that out. So being responsible for the dreams would be sort of paying attention to that moment of awakening, which maybe relates to the whole logical time thing to get you on started on the right foot. And so having good dreams, proper dreams, dreams you, or at least you feel ethically right about, whatever that means, is, I don't know, now it's starting to feel a little Protestant, but I don't know.
I think what he claims is that if you have, I don't know, a dream, a pervert dream, I don't know, to rape a woman, I don't know, and it's bad, of course, by the law, but you do it, and then you go to jail, and then to say, are you guilty? For him, you should say, yeah, I'm guilty. I'm responsible for my dreams, for my desires. I think that's the kind of responsibility that he's talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense also with the Zizekian, his most important, one of his most important concepts of his revision of Lacan's theory of the act as this kind of libidinal night of the world sort of proposal that our drives are a kind of circuit board that can undergo a kind of revolution unto themselves in a way. So you sort of like a libidinal theory of subjective transformation, right? Which is not limited to the analytic situation. It's kind of a socio-political theory. So because his whole thing there is the way that the state apparatus also determines dreams as well. So there's a kind of link to the social dimension there. It's not fully a subjective theory as well, I think.
Remember in the talk he gave to, maybe he was writing this book on the Incontinence of the Void, and it was talking about architecture. He said to architects, and I think in the talk as well, he said this, be conscientious, that's not what he said, be conscientious of what you build, because you're building our dreams, building the cityscapes, the futures, maybe that's sort of a mixing of the cold and warm streams. That in that sort of cautionary note to architects, for example, to designers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that kind of links back to the superstructural dimension of ideology as well.
Yeah.
Just to contrast this with Bloch, right? Just so that we're clear on like what the choice is. From Bloch's perspective, this proposal that we are responsible for our dreams, this is a strange question from the stand which he would say is from the standpoint of intact bourgeois propriety in the daytime ego, right? So I think it's fundamentally two different ways of reckoning with what is going on here.
Yeah. One of your questions, I believe, was this distinction being made between dreams and daydreaming, and if we can redeem night dreaming, so to speak. I think we can answer this question by trying to follow Bloch very carefully, because I don't think he's totally rejecting Freud. He even says at some point, like, if there's one contribution Freud made, this, then the other, where he, like, and even throughout the whole entire thing, there is this kind of tone, I think, where it's like, he's like, Freud's not the worst. I think Bloch is trying to say, in my opinion, in my reading, he's having a quarrel with the later Freud. Like, he believes that like earlier Freud, and like he believes the libidinal energies are a real thing, which I think he like validates not through so much through Freud, but through like Pavlov's dog. He talks about this a number of times. So anyway, I just think if we're going to resurrect dreams, I think first of all, we might do so by trying to return back to earlier Freud through Bloch. But also, I think we need to think of when Bloch is critiquing dreams, is he critiquing dreams as formulated through Freud's analysis of bourgeois patience? Is he critiquing dreams in general? I think is a good question to ask. So yeah, I think that's where the groundwork would begin in talking about whether or not we can redeem dreams here.
In an essay called Creative Writers and Daydreaming by Freud, 1908, he likens the praxis of analysis to creative writing. And the whole thing is a pretty fun, it's literally cute. It's a creative writing piece. Freud is emphasizing creative writing over daydreaming. And for him, the difference is because creative writing is an active process. It's like a construction process. It's writing. And daydreaming for Freud is idle, and you're a spectator. The ego is a spectator. But this goes to what you said, Connor, about Freud and class. Here he is blind because a daydream for someone who is really in the throes of deprivation is maybe already utopian. You know what I mean? Like a bourgeois daydream might be idle. It might just be like some empty, passive, addictive thing. But if you really nothing or really want a better future, need one, don't have much, maybe it's not such, and maybe Freud didn't have enough patience to get that sort of experience and make his knowledge off of that.
Mm-hmm. I think, Alex, you'd really like the Hans Sachs essay on Daydream, which is the most elaborate psychoanalytic reading of Daydream that I've encountered. Builds off of Freud's. Itai, could you go back to the quote on Bloch on dreams?
Right.
Thank you, page 80. Okay, thank you. Itai, what do you make of the notion of free will here in that quote?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think the first thing to say about this is that Bloch does something that I think is a very bad habit that a lot of thinkers do, which is that they analyze things they disagree with as resistance, right? And I think that this is a bad habit that a lot of like psychoanalytic adjacent thinkers will do, where they'll see someone disagreeing with them and they'll say, oh, wow, that's an interesting resistance you have there, right? And he'll do that a lot in his writing. I think it's not a very compelling move, right? Because it doesn't tell you anything about the person that's asking this question to tell you that they're being resistant, right? It just means that, oh, we have a struggle and this person is struggling, right? But that actually doesn't tell you anything about the nature of what they're thinking. Beyond that, though, I think, you know, it's interesting how he frames this, right? He'll say, a moralist from the final period of the Enlightenment, right? So he's framing this ultimately as a moral problem, right? That the responsibility that's relevant is a moral responsibility. And so we could imagine, yes, of course, there's this kind of juridical, like, you know, you have to, I don't know, like the example that someone was giving before about like, you have to confess, I am guilty for having whatever deviant desires, right? That would be a very juridical way of thinking about it. But it's not actually obvious to me that the juridical way of thinking about it is the only way to understand this, right? it seems to me that when we talk about man's moral duty, right? Yeah, okay, that can be construed in a bourgeois way, but it could also be construed in a more revolutionary way, right? We can imagine like all of the kind of left-wing Kantians, right? People like Karatani and many others who will talk about the kind of the way that the categorical imperative taken to a logical conclusion is a communist imperative, right? So if we understand moral duty in that sense, and Bloch actually, I think, literally says, a very funny analysis of the 1917 revolution. He says that the 1917 revolution was the categorical imperative armed with a rifle, right? So I feel like Bloch, even on his own terms, is not really, he's on shaky ground here, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
If I could return to like the original question I was trying to talk about, this just occurred to me, but I hold my earlier sentiment that Bloch is not trying to totally reject Freud's framework, but rather take things that he finds redemptive about it and build from there. I think one of the, and this is where the project becomes really ambitious in trying to build on Freud's framework, is he introduces this term of the body ego, which is, as far as I know, a completely new idea, which I thought was very interesting. And if I remember correctly, he talks about the body ego as so as to introduce the emotion as a drive, right? Which is a completely new idea. But anyway, I thought maybe we could like think about that some more. But to again return to the question, I would ask, is it possible for the body ego to have redemptive night dreams? If emotions are a drive, are those emotions that are redemptive when they're awake, why would they suddenly become regressive or this or that when we're sleeping? And perhaps to undercut my own analysis, or at the very least to return to the text, Bloch is making this argument that all of the stimuli that we experience in our dreams is supposedly not good. I can try to find it, but yeah, he makes this argument that during our sleep, a very broad claim, stimuli bad. So I think that's something we can try to challenge. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Connor, just to kind of like extend your point there a little bit, because I agree with you, right? I think it's a little bit too neat to say that the night dream is just oblivion, that the night dream is just sinking down into the archaic. Like maybe that's part of what happens in the night dream, right? But like, I mean, even in my own experience, like I think a lot about my dreams that I have at night, right? And I'll often have dreams where I like wake up and I say, oh, that gives me a complete different perspective on what I should be doing in the future, right? So it just, like as a descriptive thing, it just doesn't seem to me to be the case that like all the dreams I have while I'm asleep are actually looking backwards.
I wonder how all this relates to when Lacan thinks that the real dream is when you're awake, right? That night dreams are just a breakthrough from reality. Like reality is the real dream. So how can we think that dream of reality with the daydream? How we separate these two dimensions of dreaming, we can say.
Well, it's funny too, because I think I understand your point, and I believe I've heard Zizek say a very similar point, which complicates things. But Zizek is also somebody who says in the beginning of this Sublime Object that this kind of fetishization of dreaming is not correct, insofar as dreaming is very simply a different way of thinking. You know, it's not so exceptional, it's so different from regular thinking. So this kind of mystification of it, whatever, you know, it's not an exalted way of thinking, I just mean to say. But yeah, again, hitting back to Itai's point, returning to it, why is the stimulus that we experience while we're dreaming suddenly not something to be cultivated for revolutionary potential? Because, I mean, we experience stimuli while we're awake, and you see the obvious parallel I'm drawing here. So.
Well, just so that there's not too much silence on the track, does anyone have any thoughts on this seventh question, the question that Connor raised earlier? I have a definition of correlationism. This is from Brassier, that the correlationist affirms the indissoluble primacy of the relation between thought and its correlate. And he'll also make the explicit claim in that same book, it's one of the footnotes, that Bloch is in his like long list of correlationists. So I guess, like, do we agree with this? Do we think that's right? And if that is right, then what does that mean for how we understand him?
You have a view on this yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I can give my perspective on it.
Go for it.
You know, I think that there is a good side and a bad side, in a very vulgar sense, to correlation, right? That like Kant is a good example of this, right? Like, obviously, Kant wants to kind of limit reason to make room for faith, right? But Kant is also giving us one of the most sophisticated apparatuses for understanding the structure of our cognition, right? So I would say similarly, like, and so in that sense, he's a correlationist, but he's also telling us something that's epistemically salient, right? In a very similar sense, I think Bloch, there's a part of this correlationism where he's kind of writing off any kind of direct cognition of the real, or maybe not direct, maybe direct is not the right word, but he's writing off any kind of realism in the strong sense, right? That there's only going to be what we have through the access from the correlation. However, I do think that we actually learn a lot from understanding the way that Bloch is structuring his correlationism, right? So I would say, like, we need to be able to divide within the correlationism into the part of it that is helpful and the part of it that is, and I would say the part of it that's helpful is the part of it that is compatible with a kind of scientific realism, that is compatible with a kind of cold rationalism, that is compatible with the idea that, you know, our own experience is not the last word, right? And that insofar as Bloch does want to say that our experience is the last word, then he's landing us in hot water. That's my perspective.
For Meillassoux, the sort of virtue of correlationism, as opposed against like the pre-critical philosophies, was that it sort of wards off dogmatism, which is kind of maybe in line with the scientism they're saying, and the Kantianism. The worry there, for Meillassoux at least, I think, is that the temptation on the other side is that it goes into fanaticism against that dogmatism. But I don't know. I think that was a good read. But I'm not, can you put Bloch in here for me?
I'm sorry, which quote are you looking for?
No, can you connect this to Bloch? I know it's your question. I just want to sort of start saying the words.
I mean, I guess Bloch is writing explicitly from the perspective of the warm stream, right? And so he is acknowledging that there is this cold stream, and that Like there is going to be some relation to it, but he's not telling us yet what that relation is, or how it's constructed, or you know, whether the warm stream like is a supplement to the cold stream, or it's all very obscure at this point, right? And I would say that there's a tendency in his work, and I'm not sure that it's more than a tendency, but that there's a tendency to overestimate the warm stream to the point where, yes, it becomes a kind of fanaticism, right? It becomes an absolute knowing that is, you know, purely humanistic, that is purely from the perspective of consciousness, and that is not ultimately indexed to a kind of impersonal scientific universe, right? And so I guess what I worry about is like, what is the link between a scientific world which is concerned with the sub and the transpersonal, right? Like fundamentally, and Bloch's descriptions, which are ultimately concerned with a more manifest, like how the world appears to us.
It's hard because it's like we have to have a conversation on his materialism before we can answer this adequately, because I feel that the unfinished project of potentiality and his kind of revision of Aristotle and all of that is at the heart of this problem, precisely because collective subjectivity is also a part of the same dynamic. So I feel as if we need to read the materialism problem by Bloch in more careful detail before we truly get a grasp on his correlationism.
And by the way,
Yeah, we'll be going to that next week.
Sorry? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say correlationism doesn't originate with Meillassoux. In the same footnote that I was mentioning before from Nihil Unbound, Brassier makes the really interesting point that actually you find this already in Lenin. You find this already in the materialism essay from Lenin. And Bloch would have known that essay, right? So it's kind of interesting to think about that. But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Daniel.
I just think we should table this question for next week because, yeah, it's a great question. I just don't know if we have like, I think the reading we're going to do for next week will be in a better position to talk about this question. So we should bring it back up.
I have a quote. Maybe we can kind of try to address this materialist question like right now. Of course, we can talk about it later, but just very quickly then, I guess I'll say, yeah, to kind of make a superficial characterization of Bloch here, it seems as though he's taking an extreme position in saying that we do not need past history. What we need is a understanding and appreciation of the conditions of our respective lived experiences, right? All the rest is kind of not necessary. And in that way, we were talking about Walter Benjamin last week. This would seem to be a kind of direct rejection of a project like Pieces on the Philosophy of History, right? This whole project of redeeming revolutionary history so as to guide us in our future revolutionary activity. But here I was thinking especially of Benjamin. It has a bit of that flavor. This is on page 69. Libido, which is confined in animals to the mating season. Power drive, which sets in it at the earliest with the division into classes, appears secondary in contrast, but incidentally all have hunger, appetite within them. The latter's need to be satisfied, this is the power drive, is the oil in the lamp of history. That's like very Benjamin. But even this primary need looks different according to the changing ways in which needs are satisfied. Economic interest forms the final instance in the historically existing framework of drives. But even this, precisely this once again, as we know, has its changing historical forms, the changes in the mode of production and exchange. So first of all, the idea that the drives are themselves historically determined and how they express themselves is a very crazy idea. Like this is very provocative, let's call it. But I guess if we were to put Bloch and Benjamin in conversation with one another, Bloch would simply say that, sure, we can try to redeem revolutionary history, but that will only be of use to us, not just because it is revolutionary history, but because there is something of the conditions of that previous history that are resonant today. So yeah, at bottom, Bloch is undercutting and underselling this idea that looking to the past will just because of the virtue of doing that, help us.
One thing I'll say to that, Connor, and we talked about this last time. Josh brought this up, and I think Josh brought this up, if I remember correctly. That there's something here very similar to the way Fisher will talk about like the project of past futures or lost futures, right? That what we're trying to do is we're trying to go back and find all of these moments, Munzer and all of these other utopian traces, right? Where there was a future that was never really lived up to. And then what can we kind of dredge up, salvage from those past futures that is still radical today? So I don't think he's dismissing the past, but I think he's dismissing, you could say, the pastness of the past. Like he's only interested, not in this, I mean, Benjamin talks about the accumulating pile, right, of that the angel wants to repair it, but it can't. It's just pushed forward into the future. And I think Bloch would say, well, that's not quite right. Like we can actually go into the pile and we can figure out like what can be reclaimed.
Yeah, I think the main issue is the past being represented as not so much like unchangeable, but completed. And I think where this relates to psychoanalysis, it would be the idea that that we will never be able to overcome Oedipal triangulation, which relates to, I guess, Deleuze and Guattari in that sense. So yeah, as you said, Itai, for Bloch, a large part of Bloch's project, as we discussed last week, is a returning to the past. But it's a way of reorienting those aspects of the past, towards a future of some kind. I quite like thinking of it in terms of I don't know if any of you are familiar with Meillas's concept of like divine in existence, but I quite like thinking of it in terms of these cultural aspects of the past that we return to. They don't yet fully exist, and that's kind of a good thing, and that's, I guess, that's kind of the that really gives us something to work with. I sort of lost my point a little bit there, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to just read this quote I really liked from page 9. It is, Marxist philosophy is that which at last adequately addresses what is becoming and what is approaching, also knows the whole of the past in creative breadth, because it knows no past other than the still living, not yet discharged past. So not maybe this sort of long past, but like, and maybe that even doesn't mean in time, like the recent past of those where those lost futures are, like the last few centuries, maybe even to be specific. Marxist philosophy is that of the future, therefore also the future in the past, thus in the collected consciousness of front. It is living theory practice of comprehended tendency familiar with occurrence in league with the novum.
I think at bottom, it's kind of just to grossly break this down, but just a classic Hegelian kind of appreciation of this, right? Revolutionary history in general is not going to help us in our particular situation. It's in first confronting our particular situation that we can confront the general project of revolution, right? The past is not going to put its cape on to save us, nor can we put our cape on to save the past. It's us today. Like we have to figure this out. That's kind of where Bloch's at in my reading of it.
Josh, you know this better than I do, but there's one of his texts that starts with, like, I am here, we are together, that is enough, now we must begin, something like that, right? I don't remember the exact. Sorry?
I know, sorry, I made a joke. I said, I think that's the Beatles.
Oh, yeah. Something like that.
Yeah, I am here, you and me. Yeah, yeah.
A lot of it also is kind of linked up to the correlation conversation, as well as the conversation on dreams, because Bloch will make this whole nice argument that collective subjects facing the newness of a situation or facing a social condition such as prior to the French Revolution, or such as the German peasant revolt of 1525 or Russian Revolution, he claims that they derive collective images of a not yet become of the world, and that these images provide a kind of illumination of a new realm of freedom. And so then it's a kind of way for him to instantiate the not yet conscious actually in the world. So this, what I'm referring to, is actually really nicely elaborated on page 143. And he says that capitalist time, the way that capitalist life understands the new, is always overly utilitarianized. So it's like it sees prophecy as a kind of regressive tendency, as tapping into some existing essence of wisdom in the past that's locked in a cellar, or it sees prophecy as like winning the lottery in a utilitarian logic. But he says that the not yet conscious of a youthful revolutionary movement somehow poses a break from that form of temporality. And that, I think, is very interesting to think about it that way, because they create a different set of images. And I think that is obviously through the mechanism of daydreaming and things of this nature. So all of that I found quite powerful, actually, because it links up all the stuff about Munzer, and we should never underestimate how influential all of that has been on kind of post-1990s communist, post-Marxist communist thinking. I mean, even in Bordiga, you have the notion of communist invariance. And obviously in Bad Jew, you also have something close to this as well. But I think Bloch is a real originator of this idea.
Yes, I think you're right, Daniel. I would also add one of Bloch's contemporaries, Erich Fromm, much less fashionable today.
Yeah.
But I would say Fromm is actually probably, of the Frankfurt School, the person who takes the prophetic imagination most seriously. Fromm has a lot of really interesting works on the like Judeo-Christian understanding of prophecy, and how prophecy is like one of these really like revolutionary points in that tradition.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap there. I wonder what you all think about that. I mean, it is very similar to Bajew's proposal of a nomination procedure, right? That the kind of construction of a site, right? The construction of a site of the labor, of the work of militant subjects does produce, for him, because he's very Lacanian, he's interested in understanding this vis-a-vis a kind of structural linguistic model and so on. Not exactly, but he's much more in this. But for Bloch, he's thinking about this theory through a theory of images mostly, which I think is interesting. Or rather, not only images, but also aesthetics, because I think he's also thinking about art making, and he's thinking about forms of art and music that also adhere to this principle. So I suppose like what interests Bloch would be like art, forms of art that you can identify this break from utilitarian treatment of time, if that makes sense. Like, that's abundant within our culture already. And you could sort of analyze it like this, you know?
Yeah, I guess I would just like, I don't know, I'd just like to add, this is a bit of a hunch of mine. I think that Bloch's project itself is a bit historically determined. Perhaps we can see this in regards to, again, like, you can tell I'm Walter Benjamin build, but whatever. I remember somebody previously said that, you know, there was a certain point during the labor movement in like the 19th century where they thought it was going to happen. You know, there was this real thing that was happening. They felt like it was right in their grasp. And it failed, you know, and like there was some point where Marx was just like, you know, man, fuck, like we're in this for the long haul, right? And I feel as though there's a lot of scholarship kind of doing this like autopsy of the movement of like, let's say the past 50 years when like Benjamin was writing, and Benjamin himself was kind of, perhaps the thesis on philosophy of the history is a bit of a lamentation of this failed movement and so on. And Bloch is kind of intervening to say like trying to kick themselves in the ass, like, guys, I get it, it sucks, but we have to look towards the future, like, get it together, like, this is serious. So yeah, and he does.
Wait. That sounds more like a normative claim. I don't think he's making a normative claim. Do you? You know what I mean? The distinction there. He's trying to say.
Could you? Yeah.
Go ahead. No. It goes back to the conversation on morality and free will. Like,
okay.
He's not making this kind of we ought to, maybe implicit in his argument, but I don't think he needs to make that argument. He doesn't need to make a normative claim. He's trying to locate this as a kind of principle that's already animating consciousness, it's already present. He's giving us a hermeneutic tool to unlock it. Here's a way to read culture. Here's a way to read art. Here's a way to watch film and television and see this principle at play, to tease it out, to find this unfinished emancipatory dimension to the right, to, like, all around you. This is how I understand Bloch. It's giving us that kind of, I don't know, like, it's a part of his method in a way. Like, that's a gift of his method, I feel.
No, it's totally, I agree with everything.
You know what I mean? In that sense, it's not maybe as direct, but it could be. It could also be a little bit of that too.
No, I think everything said is absolutely correct. Again, like, this is just a hunch of mine. I just, you know, am eliciting a bit of urgency from like this text in like in a broader sense. So yeah. And I don't know. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Luis. Go.
It is interesting that if there is not a normative claim, it's not deontological, because I was just reading a passage here about Zizek, about Hegel, right, of his move from deontology to ontology, right. If that's the case, right, then going back to this question about is Bloch trapped in correlationism, right, then can we claim that Bloch is outside of correlationism, right? If he's making an ontological claim rather than the ontological claim. I don't know. This is going out of the discussion, but I don't know. An idea.
What do you think, Itai?
Josh, do you want to go? I saw that you unmuted.
Well, I was actually I wanted to maybe just go back to Dan's point about the role of images in revolutionary movements. But it's just quite I just wanted to say in the expressionism text that we looked at last week, one of the interesting questions that Bloch poses in that text is, what does a popular art look like that is irreducible to kitsch? And I think this is quite a significant question. I think the reading for next week will look more closely at Bloch's. Interestingly, I know that next week is really going to be about Bloch's materialism, but in the text, in the set reading, there is quite a significant section on Bloch's theory of art, if you like, which introduces the idea of the art of pre-appearance. So yeah.
It looks like Billie Eilish, anticipatory consciousness for sure. Yeah, I would like to hear more if y'all have some, like what we could say tentatively anticipatory consciousness is. And maybe if it's like you're saying how there's a break, Daniel, with the temporality of capitalism, if there's like a just different sort of, if it is just a discontinuity, or I don't know. I would like to have something said about anticipatory consciousness while we're here. And you asked why Freud maybe didn't really stumble on this idea of a not yet conscious.
Yeah,
that's a good question. It's a good question.
Itai, did you want to maybe approach this?
Well, I can say something about it, but it sounded like someone else wanted to go. So if someone else has anything that they want to say, please go ahead. Maybe I'm wrong. Well, I guess there's a few threads that I want to just very quickly touch on. To the idea of like Bloch's method, right? I wasn't sure the last time, but I think now I feel more confident saying that what Bloch is doing is a kind of phenomenology. I think it's pretty fair to say that. It's not a phenomenology in the kind of standard sense, right? It's not a phenomenology, maybe even in the Husserlian sense. Unlike Husserl, we're not dealing with like the acts of foundation and so on. But I do think that it's pretty clear to me that we are analyzing how consciousness appears to itself. And in particular, we're analyzing how consciousness is oriented, is kind of stretched out, extended out towards the future, right? And so I think like, you know, again, this last week we talked about this a little bit with the non-synchronicity part of Bloch's work. Like, how do we locate the non-synchronous elements in culture, in thought, in life? And then how do we see how those non-synchronous elements are what precisely motivate people to go in the wrong direction, right? So like, why do people become fascists? Why do people today become alt-right, neo-reactionary, whatever? Why are we seeing all of these, you know, returns of extreme right-wing nationalism and so on? And Bloch's perspective on this would be because there's actually something really important in the kind of utopia of the nation, in the utopia of the community, in the utopia of feeling belonging, right? And that doesn't mean that we somehow like resurrect nationalism or that we resurrect these forms, but it means that we have to understand why people are drawn to them, right? And so I think, you know, the anticipatory consciousness from Bloch's perspective is to go back into these maybe unsavory areas and say, okay, like what was hopeful for people about Trump? What was hopeful for people about this or that, right? Doesn't mean we acknowledge it, doesn't mean that we like endorse it, doesn't mean that we say yes to it, but like what is it about it that made people excited, right? And I think Bloch is like very openly trying to reclaim that hope and saying like, you know, all of the hope that belongs to patriotism, it doesn't belong to patriotism. It actually belongs to us, right?
Maybe the left can combat that sort of energy with its own kind of joyfulness that Bloch is trying to really living, sort of joyful thing to draw from. like you said Hegel's phenomenology was like a highway of despair, or like despair's journey. This is like adventures. This is a hope's adventure. That's the phenomenology, sort of, if it had a hero's journey kind of thing. It's what is just popped in my head.
So if you claim that what Bloch is doing is a phenomenology, can we say that there is no an overall theory of his thought, right? It's just a description.
That would be my claim. I would say that like the best counter argument you can give to Bloch is to actually say, oh, well, hold on a second, like this phenomenon that you're describing, actually, there's a counter description that you're not accounting for, right? And I think you can do that, for example, with the night dream, right? I think you can say like, hold on a second, I'm not sure your theory of the night dream is complete, right? But I think those are the only arguments against Bloch that he would actually take seriously, because he would otherwise just say like, okay, it doesn't really matter if you don't like normatively agree with me. Do you think my description is complete or not? Again, I'm not saying that like this is the best way to argue, but I do think that that's essentially how he's arguing.
That's your description.
It's my description of his method. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, the other question is as well, is what I think, sorry, because I lost connection a little bit there, and I'm sorry if this has already been addressed, but the other question is, what kind of phenomenology is Bloch doing? I know you said, Itai, that it might not, it might necessarily be the kind of Husserlian phenomenology, but, to what extent is this akin to Hegel's phenomenology? I think Captain Wall is quite interesting in her claim in the materialismus commentary that the principle of hope is Bloch's phenomenology, but then what comes after is Bloch's ontology and epistemology. Interestingly enough, these two aspects that I dealt with in the materialismus problem, which was I think it was published after the principle of hope.
I think it was before, actually. Wasn't it before?
Okay, but it was written before, right? So
Yeah,
this is Catmull's sort of, I think, quite interesting.
Right. It was censored from publication.
Well, yeah, it was written in sort of manuscripts, and I think I can't remember the actual historical details around its publication, but yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Yeah, to think about where Bloch's ontology and epistemology fits into this. And unfortunately, the materialismus book is not materialismus problem book is not published. It's not translated. Yeah, sorry. It is published though in German. But yeah, we might touch upon some of these questions next week. But yeah, anyway, just to go back to my point, I think this is quite an interesting question. Okay, the principle of hope, maybe it is a phenomenology, but then is that a phenomenology that then leads towards, I guess, a kind of logic, in the Hegelian sense, or does it warrant a kind of logic in the Hegelian sense? And yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I think there's an essay by Peter Thompson, the translator of Bloch, that addresses that question in the Privatization of Hope series that he wrote with Zizek. Because there's also a spirit of utopia that we have to fit into this trilogy and how that might link there as well. So, but I recognize it's 6 minutes after our conclusion time. So wanted to thank Itai for facilitating a very robust session. And is there any final thoughts? Itai, did you have anything else you wish to lay out there?
Just for today, we didn't really get a chance to say much about the difference between Bloch's idea of anticipation and the Lacan piece. I didn't assign it as reading or anything, so I'm not like upset that we didn't talk about this. However, I do think that if you're interested in this question of anticipation, there's a really good essay that's waiting to be written that would be comparing three thinkers. Number one, Lacan, right? And looking at Lacan's prisoner's dilemma. Number two, Badiou's kind of revision of the prisoner's dilemma in theory of the subject. And then number three would be Bloch on anticipation. And I think you could actually say something really interesting about how these three work together.
You have to do it now.
Maybe if I'm working with someone else, it's probably not something that I could do alone.
Yeah, it sounds like a great project though. Okay, thank you again, and we'll see you in 1 week from now.
Great job. Great job.
Take care.
Thank you.
Ciao. Later.